There's a different kind of fear. The kind that hits when you realize someone else just put your entire life on the line, without telling you. That's exactly what happened to Alyssa the night $318,000 disappeared.
Alyssa Morgan believed in systems. At 36, she worked as a senior cybersecurity analyst in Atlanta, trained to detect subtle irregularities before they became catastrophic breaches. Her life operated on layered security, diversified investments, and monitored assets contingency plans. Her husband, Damon Pierce, operated differently. Damon believed fortune favored speed. He chased private equity forums, invitation-only Telegram channels, and whispered opportunities labeled pre-market access. Alyssa tolerated the ambition because ambition wasn't inherently dangerous. Secrecy was. The night she logged into their Fidelity joint portfolio to review quarterly adjustments, she saw a wire she did not authorize. $318,000 transferred under the memo, Velocity Infrastructure Tier 1. Her breath slowed unnaturally. That was not discretionary capital. That was their refinance surplus, retirement buffer, and liquidity reserve combined. She walked into the living room where Damon sat scrolling projections on his iPad. "Tell me that's reversible," she said evenly. He didn't flinch. He didn't apologize. He looked energized. "It's positioned," he replied. "Positioned where?" "Private Infrastructure Corridor Fund. Pre-IPO energy routing." The phrases sounded rehearsed. Alyssa studied him carefully. Without discussing it, Damon exhaled, irritation creeping into his voice. "You overanalyze everything." This required speed. Alyssa felt something colder than anger settle in her chest. Speed was rarely strategy. It was pressure disguised as urgency. And urgency was how predators bypassed scrutiny. She asked one final question, her tone controlled. "What exactly did you sign to gain Tier 1 access?" Damon hesitated just briefly. That hesitation told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't just a wire. It was leverage. And leverage always came with collateral. Alyssa did not sleep that night. Instead, she dissected Velocity Infrastructure Group the way she would a suspected ransomware payload. The website was immaculate, high-resolution drone footage of pipelines, renewable corridors, and steel frameworks stretching across deserts. It referenced J.P. Morgan syndicates and European sovereign backing. Testimonials came from Tier Alpha participants, with no surnames attached. She checked SEC filings. None matched. The company had registered in Wyoming 4 months earlier under a layered LLC shield. Anonymous managers. No verifiable financial history. Her phone buzzed at 2:13 a.m. Unknown number. Tier 1 confirmed. Expansion window active. Her pulse tightened. Another message followed instantly. Liquidity unlock required within 48 hours. She hadn't reached out to anyone. Which meant the moment Damon wired funds, their contact data was absorbed into Velocity's escalation system. She reopened the contract Damon forwarded earlier. Buried beneath expansion participation terms was a clause labeled contingent asset assurance. Her breathing slowed dangerously. Secondary collateral may be secured to guarantee fulfillment of liquidity obligations. Alyssa leaned back slowly. Secondary collateral meant property. Real property. She walked upstairs and stood at the bedroom doorway watching Damon sleep. How deep had he gone before telling her? What exactly had he pledged to gain Tier 1 status? And why did this unlock window feel less like an opportunity and more like a countdown mechanism engineered to force compliance? The answer came with documentation. When Alyssa demanded full disclosure the next morning, Damon hesitated before forwarding the complete agreement. She read silently, heart pounding once she reached the security annex. "What secondary asset?" she asked without looking up. Damon shifted uncomfortably. "It's precautionary." "Against what?" she pressed. He swallowed. "Volatility exposure." Alyssa raised her eyes slowly. "What did you pledge?" Damon's silence stretched too long. Finally he whispered, "The warehouse." The word landed like impact. The distribution warehouse in Marietta her father left her, paid off, stabilized, generating consistent lease income from 3 local businesses. "You filed against it?" she asked, voice steady. He nodded once. Alyssa didn't scream. She grabbed her purse and drove straight to Fulton County Records. The clerk pulled up the property file and confirmed it. A conditional lien filed 27 hours earlier under Velocity Infrastructure Holdings LLC. Alyssa stared at the digital stamp in disbelief. Can they enforce? She asked quietly. If liquidity terms default, the clerk replied. Alyssa stepped back into the Georgia heat, feeling clarity settle over fear. Damon hadn't simply invested money. He had leveraged inheritance. Velocity wasn't selling returns. They were attaching ownership. And the 48-hour liquidity window suddenly felt like engineered pressure designed to convert temporary trust into permanent transfer. When Alyssa returned home, a black Range Rover sat across the street. Engine idling. Windows tinted. Watching. Her phone buzzed again. Collateral verification scheduled. The driver's side door opened. A tall man in a tailored navy suit stepped out, expression calm and clinical. "Mrs. Morgan," he said smoothly. "Elliot Cade, Velocity Compliance Liaison." Alyssa crossed her arms. "You don't have authorization to be here." He smiled politely. "Your agreement permits asset confirmation." Damon appeared behind her, pale and suddenly uncertain. Elliot handed her a printed notice. Liquidity expansion deposit. $140,000 due within 48 hours. Failure triggers collateral acceleration. Alyssa read it carefully. Why increase liquidity if Tier 1 is profitable? Elliot tilted his head slightly. Scaling requires synchronized participation. She met his gaze evenly. Or vulnerability. His smile thinned. Participation demonstrates commitment. She felt anger sharpen into precision. Commitment to what? Infinite escalation. Elliot did not answer. Instead, he adjusted his cufflinks and said quietly, "Acceleration is automatic if terms are unmet." He returned to the Range Rover and drove away. Alyssa watched until the vehicle disappeared. Then she turned to Damon slowly. "How much did you send?" "All of it," he whispered. She nodded once. "Then this isn't scaling." She looked toward the warehouse listed under lien. "It's acquisition." Alyssa didn't confront Damon again that night. There was no strategic value in emotional repetition. Instead, she shifted into assessment mode. She sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open, dissecting the Velocity contract line by line while Damon paced behind her, muttering about timing and missed upside. The expansion liquidity clause wasn't ambiguous, it was engineered. It created a performance illusion. Initial deposit, rapid appreciation projection, and then unlock participation requirement. But the most dangerous language appeared in the enforcement subsection. Collateral acceleration may proceed without additional notice upon failure of synchronized liquidity contribution. Synchronized, Alyssa repeated quietly. Damon stopped pacing. That just means coordinated investment. She looked up at him slowly. It means they decide when you're out of sync. Her phone buzzed again. Liquidity window adjusted. 24 hours remaining. The clock had shortened. He checked the timestamp. It had been manually updated, not automated. Damon's face drained of color. Why would they reduce it? Alyssa closed the laptop gently. Because urgency increases compliance. She stood and walked to the window. The black Range Rover was back. Same position. Engine idling. Not subtle anymore. Damon swallowed. Maybe we should just pay it. Alyssa turned toward him, calm and precise. If you feed escalation, it doesn't stop. She pointed toward the lien documentation on the counter. They aren't investing in infrastructure. Her voice hardened. They're acquiring assets through engineered panic. The next morning, Alyssa contacted Marcus Vale before Damon even finished his coffee. Within 2 hours, she was seated across from him in his midtown office, sliding every document and screenshot across the glass table. Marcus read in silence, occasionally marking sections with a pen. This isn't traditional fraud, he said finally. It's structured leverage. They design compliance fatigue. Alyssa leaned forward. Can they legally enforce the lien? Marcus nodded slowly. They can attempt enforcement under contract. But the escalation pattern, shortened windows, physical inspection threats, that's coercive. He pulled up comparative case filings from Texas and Florida. Same tier language. Same unlocked deposits. Same collateral attachment. They centralize intake through one escrow processor, Marcus said. That's their weakness. Alyssa's phone buzzed mid-conversation. Acceleration preparation initiated. Her pulse steadied instead of spiking. They're pushing, she said calmly. Marcus leaned back. Then we file emergency injunction before they convert lien to enforcement. And if they escalate physically, she asked. Marcus met her gaze evenly. Then it becomes criminal intimidation. Alyssa nodded once. Good. She stood. Let's move faster than they do. By noon, Marcus had filed the emergency motion in Fulton County citing fraudulent inducement and predatory collateralization. Alyssa returned home to find Damon sitting in silence at the kitchen island. They increased it, he whispered. She opened the new notice. Liquidity expansion updated, $210,000. Her jaw tightened. They're testing your breaking point, she said. Damon's voice cracked. If we just comply once more, it won't end, she interrupted. Her phone buzzed again. A GPS pin dropped directly on the warehouse property in Marietta. No text. No caption. Just coordinates. Damon stared at the screen. They're not allowed to go there. Alyssa didn't respond. 30 minutes later her tenant called. There are 2 men outside asking about ownership changes, he said nervously. Alyssa's grip tightened around the phone. Don't answer questions. Call police if they enter the property. She hung up and turned to Damon slowly. This is intimidation. Damon looked shaken now. What do we do? Alyssa grabbed her keys. We make this visible. At the warehouse, 2 men in reflective vests were placing orange marker flags along the fence line. Alyssa approached them with controlled fury. Who authorized boundary marking? One of them checked a tablet. Preliminary title adjustment under Velocity Infrastructure Holdings. The words felt rehearsed. There is no adjustment, she replied sharply. There's an injunction pending. The man shrugged. We were contracted. Her phone buzzed. Acceleration finalized if expansion unmet. She dialed Marcus immediately. They're physically marking. His tone sharpened. Then the injunction must be signed today. Alyssa watched as another flag pierced asphalt near her father's old loading dock. The symbolism wasn't subtle. It was psychological territory mapping. She turned back to the men. Remove them. We can't. Her pulse slowed dangerously. She took photos, documented vehicle plates, timestamps, and contractor ID numbers. Evidence. Not anger. When she finally drove away, her phone buzzed again. 12 hours remaining. The clock wasn't about money. It was about exhaustion. Fulton County Superior Court felt colder than usual that afternoon. Alyssa sat beside Marcus as their motion was reviewed. Damon sat stiffly behind them, silent and visibly shaken. Marcus presented the staged escalation pattern, comparative complaints, and physical intimidation documentation. The judge studied the timeline carefully. The shortened liquidity windows appear coercive, she observed. Marcus nodded. Yes, Your Honor. The judge turned to Alyssa. Did you consent to collateral under misrepresented terms? No, Alyssa replied clearly. Damon lowered his head. Silence stretched for several seconds. Finally the judge spoke. Temporary restraining order granted. Enforcement suspended pending investigation. Alyssa felt air return to her lungs. The lien was frozen. Acceleration halted for now. As they stepped outside the courthouse, her phone buzzed again. You just made this public. She read the message calmly. Damon whispered, They're angry. Alyssa slipped her phone back into her purse. Good. That night, retaliation shifted tactics. Alyssa received 3 hard credit pulls under her name and 1 under Damon's. Within minutes, a mediation firm from Houston called offering private settlement terms. She put the call on speaker. Equity restructuring in exchange for withdrawal of enforcement, the woman said smoothly. You mean partial surrender, Alyssa replied. Silence followed. Then the line disconnected. Minutes later, a photo arrived on her phone. The warehouse loading dock. Fresh tire tracks. No message attached. Damon's face went pale. They're watching. Alyssa forwarded everything to Marcus and then to the FBI Financial Crimes Unit. Her phone buzzed one final time that evening. Hard to recover what's already offshore. Attached was a screenshot of their original $318,000 wire routed through a Cayman intermediary. Alyssa zoomed into the metadata string. It matched the centralized escrow processor Marcus identified earlier. She forwarded it immediately. 10 minutes later her phone rang. "This is Special Agent Laura Chin," the voice said. "That screenshot just bridged federal jurisdiction." Alyssa looked toward the dark street outside. The Range Rover was gone. The escalation had shifted. And for the first time since the wire left their account, Velocity no longer controlled the timeline. Special Agent Laura Chin did not waste time with reassurance. "We've been monitoring Velocity for 6 weeks, she told Alyssa during their secured video call the following morning. "But we lacked a transactional bridge tying domestic coercion to offshore layering. Your screenshot did that." Alyssa felt a cold steadiness settle over her. "What happens now?" she asked. Chen's tone remained precise. "We initiate emergency asset freeze requests on the escrow intermediary and associated holding accounts. That will trigger countermoves." Damon sat beside Alyssa, listening silently. "Countermoves like what?" he asked quietly. Chin did not soften her answer. "Data destruction. Account liquidation. Narrative control." Alyssa understood exactly what that meant. Velocity would attempt to reframe the story, position themselves as misunderstood venture operators unfairly targeted by dissatisfied participants. Within hours of the call, news alerts began surfacing on smaller financial blogs. Velocity infrastructure faces regulatory scrutiny amid participant dispute. The language was deliberate, minimizing, and ambiguous. Damon stared at the headlines. "They're spinning it." Alyssa nodded. "Of course they are." Her phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't a threat. It was a withdrawal notification, Velocity attempting to reroute funds internally through a Luxembourg shell. Chin called back within minutes. "We intercepted it," she said calmly. "Seizure warrant pending judicial signature." Alyssa exhaled slowly. The escalation had changed hands. Velocity was no longer pressing. They were scrambling. The federal seizure order was signed the following afternoon. Chin called again, her voice measured but firm. "Primary escrow accounts frozen. Cayman conduit flagged. 2 domestic holding entities locked pending forensic audit." Alyssa felt a quiet, controlled relief. Not victory momentum. Damon leaned forward. "What about the lien?" Chin replied, "Once fraud investigation is formally opened, civil enforcement attempts tied to Velocity become voidable." Alyssa's phone buzzed mid-sentence. This time it was Elliot Cade. She let it ring twice before answering. "You escalated unnecessarily," Elliot said, his composure thinner than before. "You misrepresented materially," Alyssa replied. Silence followed. Then he spoke carefully. "Velocity intends to resolve this discreetly." "Through another expansion window?" she asked evenly. Elliot's voice hardened slightly. "You've created exposure for yourself." Alyssa didn't blink. "No. You created it." The call ended abruptly. Moments later her tenant called again from the warehouse. "The survey markers are gone," he said. "They removed them overnight." Alyssa closed her eyes briefly. Physical intimidation had ceased. Not because Velocity chose restraint, but because federal freeze had stripped their leverage. The shift was tangible now. They were no longer circling. They were retreating. 2 days later, national outlets picked up the story. CNBC ran a segment titled "Federal Investigation Targets Private Infrastructure Firm." Bloomberg detailed the staged liquidity escalation pattern, referencing multiple state complaints. Velocity's website went dark within hours. Social media accounts disappeared. Marcus forwarded Alyssa a draft of a class action filing emerging in Illinois. "You weren't the only tier 1, he said quietly. Damon read through the complaint slowly, his face paling as he recognized identical clauses. Unlocked deposits, collateral liens, acceleration language. "They did this everywhere," he murmured. Alyssa nodded. "Scale through repetition." Later that afternoon Chin called with sharper news. Velocity's founder, Adrian Hale, attempted to liquidate personal assets through a private transfer in Miami, she said. "We flagged it." Damon's eyes widened. "Is he fleeing?" Chin paused. "He tried." Alyssa felt something shift internally, not satisfaction but confirmation. Velocity had operated with calculated composure. Now they were reacting. And reactive operators made mistakes. That evening another update surfaced. Adrian Hale had been detained at a private aviation terminal pending financial crime inquiry. The collapse wasn't rumor anymore. It was operational. With federal seizure in motion, the lien against Alyssa's warehouse was formally challenged in court. Marcus presented the freeze order and fraud designation as grounds for immediate nullification. The judge reviewed the documentation and spoke plainly. Given the federal investigation and asset freeze, enforcement attempts are suspended indefinitely. Damon exhaled sharply beside her. Alyssa felt something deeper than relief, restoration. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered as word spread of Velocity's unraveling. One asked Alyssa directly, "Did you know it was a scam immediately?" She answered without hesitation. No legitimate investment requires countdowns and collateral panic. That quote aired that evening. Velocity's remaining affiliates attempted damage control, issuing a statement claiming temporary liquidity restructuring. Within hours, the statement was contradicted by court filings and seizure documentation. The narrative war ended quickly. Facts outpaced spin. Damon looked at Alyssa quietly that night. "You saved everything." She shook her head. "We saved it by not complying." The distinction mattered. 3 weeks later, restitution proceedings began. The frozen escrow accounts held substantial capital, though not all funds would be recovered due to offshore layering. Adrian Hale was formally indicted on charges of wire fraud, conspiracy, and coercive collateralization. Elliot Cade entered negotiations for cooperation testimony. Velocity Infrastructure Holdings dissolved under federal receivership. Alyssa stood once more in the Marietta warehouse parking lot as official documentation confirmed full lien removal. The loading dock stood unchanged. The asphalt bore faint marks where survey stakes had once pierced it. Damon walked beside her quietly. "I thought speed meant advantage," he said. Alyssa studied the building carefully. Speed without scrutiny is vulnerability. Her phone buzzed one final time. A confirmation notice from Agent Chen stating that partial recovery of their original $318,000 wire had been secured under seizure distribution. It wasn't full restoration, but it was lawful recovery. Alyssa slipped the phone into her pocket and looked toward the skyline in the distance. Velocity had promised accelerated returns. What they delivered instead was accelerated exposure. And exposure, when confronted with clarity instead of fear, collapses the system that depends on silence. The federal seizure did not feel dramatic. It felt procedural and irreversible. Within 48 hours of Special Agent Laura Chen's confirmation, Velocity's primary domestic escrow accounts were frozen, and corresponding subpoenas were issued for offshore conduits tied to Cayman and Luxembourg shell entities. Alyssa sat at her dining table reviewing court documents as if they were audit logs, tracing the exact moment urgency converted into attempted acquisition. Damon watched silently, no longer defensive, no longer persuasive, just absorbing consequence. "They were never planning returns," he said quietly. Alyssa nodded. "They were planning transfer." The indictment against Adrian Hale detailed the structured escalation model. Tier 1 deposit, staged unlock window, accelerated collateral enforcement under manufactured liquidity shortfall. It wasn't improvisation, it was architecture. Every shortened deadline, every GPS intimidation pin, every physical inspection attempt was designed to exhaust resistance before scrutiny could intervene. Damon exhaled slowly. "I thought speed meant opportunity." Alyssa closed the file calmly. Speed meant vulnerability. The distinction settled between them like something permanent. Outside, the black Range Rover never returned. Inside, silence replaced countdown notifications. The system had shifted. Velocity no longer controlled timing. Federal oversight did. And in that shift, leverage reversed. Restitution hearings unfolded over several months, methodical and unemotional. Approximately 60% of their original $318,000 wire was recovered through seized domestic accounts, with additional assets pending international cooperation. Alyssa did not measure success by full restoration, she measured it by containment. Agent Chen explained during one call that Velocity's escrow processor centralized intake intentionally to streamline escalation sequencing. Acceleration was pre-programmed, Chin said. Not reactive. Damon listened on speaker, shoulders tense. They would have kept raising it, he murmured afterward. Alyssa met his gaze. Until collateral converted. The truth carried no anger now, only clarity. She visited the Marietta warehouse that afternoon and walked the perimeter slowly. Faint asphalt punctures marked where survey stakes once pierced the ground. Evidence of attempted possession lingered, but ownership had been restored. Damon joined her quietly. I confused exclusivity with legitimacy, he admitted. Alyssa replied evenly, legitimacy doesn't punish hesitation. The recalibration between them was subtle but real. Transparency replaced secrecy. Contracts were reviewed jointly. Decisions were slowed deliberately. Urgency lost its appeal. Adrian Hale's sentencing hearing marked the public collapse of Velocity infrastructure. Prosecutors detailed the countdown mechanics and collateral triggers in open court, emphasizing how engineered urgency distorted rational evaluation. Victim statements echoed the same pattern. Shortened liquidity windows, escalated deposit demands, GPS intimidation tactics. Alyssa declined to testify. Her statement had already been entered into the record through documented filings. When the judge delivered a 12-year federal sentence and permanent industry ban, she felt no triumph, only finality. Outside the courthouse, reporters asked for reaction. Damon squeezed her hand gently, but she walked past without comment. The outcome was not about spectacle. It was about structural containment. Velocity's architecture had depended on silence and speed. Exposure dismantled both. That evening they returned home to a quiet house. No alerts. No escalation notices. The stillness felt earned, not accidental. In the year that followed, Alyssa expanded her compliance consulting practice, focusing specifically on engineered urgency models in financial fraud. She developed training modules dissecting countdown psychology, collateral leverage clauses, and staged liquidity traps. Corporate risk teams listened carefully as she explained how exclusivity combined with time pressure bypasses due diligence safeguards. Damon attended each seminar silently, not as strategist but as reminder. After one session in Houston, he said softly, I wanted acceleration more than stability. Alyssa responded calmly, acceleration without verification destabilizes. The lesson no longer carried resentment. It carried recalibration. The warehouse remained fully operational, tenants renewed leases and refinance decisions were made conservatively with full transparency. The memory of the Range Rover idling across their street faded into context, not trauma but warning. Urgency no longer impressed them. Process did. 2 years after Velocity's collapse, restitution proceedings formally closed. Additional offshore recoveries returned a final portion of frozen assets, bringing total recovery close to 80%. Not complete but sufficient. Alyssa deposited the final funds into conservative municipal bonds and archived the case file permanently. No celebration. Just disciplined closure. Damon stood beside her as she sealed the folder. Do you regret stopping it? He asked quietly. Alyssa shook her head. I regret almost mistaking speed for value. She walked toward the living room window as Atlanta's skyline dimmed into evening. The street outside was unremarkable, no surveillance vehicles, no idling engines, no countdown messages vibrating against her phone. Velocity had promised acceleration. What it delivered was exposure. Exposure, confronted instead of fed through panic, dismantled the system entirely. Nothing leveraged. Nothing rushed. The warehouse secure. The house steady. The lesson permanent. Closure did not arrive in a single moment. It arrived in habits. Alyssa noticed it first in the quiet. No countdown emails. No encrypted priority access messages. No Telegram notifications promising accelerated tiers. The absence of urgency felt unfamiliar at first, almost disorienting. 4 months, their lives had revolved around compressed deadlines and escalating demands. Now decisions stretched across normal time again. Damon began sitting at the kitchen table each evening, reviewing budgets line by line, not because they were struggling, but because transparency had become discipline. I don't ever want us blindsided again, he said one night. Alyssa nodded, appreciating the shift. He no longer chased speed. He examined structure. Their conversations changed tone. Instead of discussing next tier entry or unlock multipliers, they talked about risk ceilings, liquidity buffers, and sustainable leverage ratios. The vocabulary of urgency had been replaced with the language of stability. Even their home felt different, less like an asset at risk and more like something anchored. The warehouse tenants renewed early, signaling confidence. Cash flow stabilized predictably. There were no sudden surges, only steady, measurable growth. Alyssa understood then that recovery was not about recapturing lost money. It was about eliminating artificial pressure. Velocity had thrived on compression. Their life would now expand deliberately. And in that expansion, calm returned. The final restitution payment cleared 18 months later, smaller than the original wire but significant enough to close the accounting gap. Alyssa deposited it without ceremony. She had stopped equating money with vindication. Instead, she tracked structural resilience, debt ratios, asset buffers, tenant diversification. Damon joined her at the office one afternoon as she finalized the updated portfolio strategy. "We could grow faster," he said cautiously, then paused, catching himself. Alyssa looked up with a faint smile. "We could," she replied evenly. "But why?" He exhaled slowly. "Old instincts." She appreciated the honesty. The temptation to accelerate never fully disappears. It simply becomes easier to recognize. They agreed to maintain conservative thresholds, no unsecured leverage, no collateral exposure beyond fixed ceilings, no agreements signed under compressed timelines. Damon suggested creating an internal rule. Any deal demanding action in under 72 hours required automatic rejection. Alyssa nodded. "Pressure is data," she said. "If they're rushing, we're stepping back." The principle felt simple now, almost obvious. Yet it had taken near collapse to internalize it. They weren't rebuilding wealth. They were rebuilding judgment. And that foundation felt stronger than any projected return curve. The Marietta warehouse became more than stabilized property. It became a case study. Alyssa was invited to speak at regional compliance conferences about engineered urgency in private equity structures. She never dramatized the experience. She dissected it. Countdown timers as psychological triggers. Escrow centralization as leverage funnel. Collateral clauses as silent acquisition tools. Damon attended one session quietly in the back row. When an attendee asked how someone intelligent could fall into such a system, Alyssa answered without hesitation. "Intelligence doesn't protect against compression," she said. "Time pressure overrides process." Damon felt the truth of that settle in his chest. He had not lacked intelligence. He had lacked pause. Afterward, he approached her outside the venue. "You didn't blame me," he said quietly. Alyssa met his eyes steadily. "Blame doesn't prevent repetition," she replied. "Process does." That exchange marked the emotional turning point more than any court ruling had. Their partnership no longer carried silent tension. It carried shared accountability. They had both nearly lost something fundamental, not just property but equilibrium. And equilibrium, once restored, became sacred. Years later, the memory of velocity infrastructure no longer triggered anxiety. It triggered analysis. The Black Range Rover, the GPS pin drops, the escalating deposit demands, they became reference points in workshops and policy memos, not personal threats. Damon occasionally revisited archived emails, not to relive them but to study the wording. Each message carried subtle compression language. Limited window, privileged access, immediate action required. He could see it clearly now. Urgency disguised as opportunity. Exclusivity framed as protection. "They never offered value," he said one evening as they reviewed long-term projections. "They offered momentum." Alyssa nodded. "Momentum without verification is volatility." The house stood unchanged. The warehouse fully leased. Their finances unremarkable in the best way possible, predictable, balanced, steady. Stability had replaced spectacle. And stability, they realized, was quieter but infinitely stronger. On a late autumn evening, Alyssa stood by the living room window watching the Atlanta skyline settle into dusk. Damon joined her without speaking. The silence between them was no longer strained, it was composed. "If velocity hadn't collapsed," Damon said softly, "we would have signed again." Alyssa considered that carefully. "Maybe," she admitted. "Until there was nothing left to sign." He nodded, absorbing the gravity of that truth. The real loss would not have been the money. It would have been the pattern, chasing acceleration until stability eroded completely. Instead, the collapse forced confrontation. Exposure replaced illusion. Process replaced impulse. She turned toward him with calm certainty. Growth isn't supposed to feel urgent, she said. It's supposed to feel durable. Outside, traffic moved normally. No surveillance vehicles. No idling engines. No countdown alerts vibrating against her phone. Velocity had promised speed. What it delivered was revelation. And revelation, though painful, built something lasting. Discipline under pressure. The warehouse remained secure. The house steady. Their partnership recalibrated. Nothing leveraged recklessly. Nothing signed in haste. The lesson had outlived the fraud. And this time, nothing would accelerate them into vulnerability again.
What almost destroyed them wasn't just the money. It was the pressure, the secrecy, and the urgency designed to make them act without thinking. And the truth is, this happens to people every single day. So if there's one thing you take from this story, let it be this. Anything that rushes you is trying to control you. If this story made you think differently, subscribe because the next one might save you from something even worse. Thank you for watching till the end.